Okay, perfect, Susan. So I have to apologize to Alexander for our starting and stopping, but it's a delight to have him with us. As a lot of you know, this year in our stream of innovations and research methods here at CORE, we've been trying to turn our attention more to social determinants of health, but not in the kind of arguably more superficial way that these issues have been treated, and really to better understand frameworks and to really draw on our colleagues in other fields. And so Faz was delighted to discover Dr. White as he was researching this area, and he came upon him looking at his writings in the New England and the Lancet. And so he comes to us from the intersections of sociology of race and ethnicity, history of medicine, global historical sociology. So I don't want to take up too much of the time making this introduction, but I think it's going to be a great opportunity for us to reframe how we think about some of these issues. And without further ado, Alexandre.
All right, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you, Dr. Khan, Dr. Dasgupta, for having me today. It's a real treat. It's, I wish I could be with you in person in Montreal. Alas, here we are. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that? Great, awesome. So really what I want to talk to you all today about are some things that we've been thinking about here at Johns Hopkins University, and with some of the folks who I'm going to mention today, who also co-wrote a paper that we wrote for the New England Journal of Medicine, really about ways of rethinking social determinants of health practice, questions of health disparities, and fundamentally how we can think about really altering our medical education around racism in medicine, its histories, the structural aspects of it in the present. And in preparing for this talk, I saw, granted that I'm south of the border, but clearly there are debates within the Canadian Medical Association and other groups in Canada looking at the questions of systemic anti-Black racism in medicine. This presentation is aimed primarily in the US context. That being said, I would hasten to add that the presentation here, while focusing largely on the African American community, is not, I think most of the teachings and concepts broadly apply to minoritized groups in the United States and Canada, but also potentially around the world, reflecting similar natures of structural violence and racism that occurs. So some questions that I really want to ask, or I want us to think with, and I hope to have plenty of time for Q&A, are, what methods, practices, and approaches are necessary for a non-oppressive anti-racist medical curriculum and medical practice? I don't really want to present a prescriptive approach in any way, but really this is a introduction and an invitation to thinking about, thinking beyond really where we're currently thinking in these areas, and hoping to recognize the social and political dynamics of infectious disease while I'm teaching medicine and other areas brought on as a result of COVID-19, but also thinking about what historically and social scientific approaches can do for medical education, and where do we bring prejudicial assumptions really fundamentally into our work in the medical field. So the objectives of this lecture are primarily to acquaint you with aspects of the racist history of medicine in the United States in particular, acquaint you with an understanding of the systemic and structural nature of the ways in which racism operates, underscore how racism can operate in the practice of medicine with a particular focus largely at the clinical level, and also encourage thinking beyond kind of the bare minimum, from thinking about unconscious bias towards, perhaps, as a sociologist and historian, thinking about more sustained analyses that draw on wider fields, recognizing that, I know that medical doctors are very, very busy, especially right now, but thinking about ways in which we can open up opportunities for greater discourse, more analysis, and more discussion that brings in other fields. So it's really exciting, Dr. Dasgupta, that you mentioned kind of the themes that you're working around this year. And then the final question that I want to leave us with is to really question whose voices should be recentered in questions of racism in medicine, its histories, and its ongoing dynamics. Now, let's begin fundamentally with a particular topic of analysis today. Racism, how it operates and has operated in relation to medicine. While for many of us, common sense understandings of racism stem from interpersonal racism, the slurs, the attacks, the lynchings, and other violences that are directed at individuals. However, in light of many of the events, especially of 2020, from the disparate effects of COVID-19 on minoritized groups around the world, to the widespread outcries against police violence, especially in the United States, the language and an understanding of structural racism is becoming more and more common in public dialogue. And I want to unpack what these terms mean. And it's important to understand how racism operates, not only because racism is known to produce or worsen health outcomes, but also because of the ways in which medicine and medical practice has been and continues to reproduce racist effects. Moreover, racial ideologies and racist forms of exclusion, as well as experimentation, have not only been incidental, especially to the formation of medicine in the United States, but actually essential to it. Segregation in medical education and in treatment have not only served to deprive certain groups of education and healthcare, but has also served to uplift those who can benefit from such forms of racial discrimination. Medical experimentation on Black and Indigenous people and Hispanic people has been critical to the formulation of medical schools and the development of entire fields of medicine, while causing great violence to those subjected to that experimentation. And like much of US society, the roots of medical practice in America too often grow through the sediment of our racial orders. So I know that in preparing for this talk, there are ways in which we've been, there are numerous articles that have come out really over the last year relating to Canada's grappling with racism in the healthcare system. And exploring these, I've seen that many of the dynamics are broadly similar. And some of the issues that emerge are kind of the systemic nature or structural nature of this racism in the healthcare system. So I want to kind of broadly define structural racism in a way that I think was really brilliantly done in this work in New England Journal of Medicine by Kristen Pallak et al., which defines structural racism as referring to the ways in which historical and contemporary racial inequities in outcomes are perpetuated by social, economic, and political systems, including mutually reinforcing systems of healthcare, education, housing, employment, the media, and criminal justice, and results in systemic variation and opportunity according to race or ethnic background, for example, in racial differentials in access to care. But structural racism is about more than the institutional effects that perpetuate racism. It is also about what Stuart Hall calls the signification of race. And I mean to say, despite race having no biological basis for determining cultural, educational, or social outcomes, its salience remains critical in its capacity to categorize persons, assign them varying worth, and assigning or dispossessing groups of privileges and rights. Markers of racial difference which change over time and are made to mean different things in different contexts. So what I mean to say is that racial differences seen in differences in skin color, hair, or a variety of other formations could be used as justifications to support different forms of oppression and negation at different times. This we can see in the history of racism in medicine and healthcare in the United States, but also in the ways that medical practice and institutions of medicine perpetuate racist beliefs, ideologies, and systems of racism. These categorizations can be the justification for racist medical practice. So a lot of what I want to talk about, especially towards the end of this talk, are really whose voices should be recentered, whose voices and scholarship can be recovered to think about what I think we're seeing, especially in the US context, as what is hopefully a meaningful reckoning with the systemic racist elements of medical practice today, histories of racism in the past, and ongoing goals of developing anti-racist medical practice for the future. So I hope to show you that we need to engage with our past as we explore the inequities of the present and consider the role of physicians to help resolve or at least reduce them in the future. And this lecture begins with a paradox. Is race a valid category in medicine or not? Imagine you live in a city ravaged by an epidemic known to be caused by an infectious agent whose morbidity and mortality are disproportionately borne by African-American bodies. A prominent scholar of health disparities reports that the strikingly excessive rate, often attributed without basis to putative biological or genetic differences between Black and white bodies, should instead be understood as a spotlight shining a bright light on fundamental racial inequalities within American society. It is this structural impact of race and racism as determinants of health, rather than any a priori biological or racial difference, that simultaneously places Black bodies at the greatest risk of getting sick and at the lowest chance of having access or being served by the mainstream healthcare system. Now, this argument should sound familiar to all of you, but we've given you really a bit of a bait and switch. While the study I just quoted was commissioned by the University of Pennsylvania, it was not a report on the differential morbidity and mortality of COVID-19 in Philadelphia in 2020. Rather, the report on the differential health and welfare of the Philadelphia Negro, first published in 1899, was supported partly to provide an empirical foundation to demonstrate the racial disparities in mortality from tuberculosis, the most fatal disease, quote, the most fatal disease for Negroes, end quote, were themselves a product of social forces. Written by the polymathic sociologist, novelist, playwright, and scholar of health disparities, I would argue, W.E.B. Du Bois, the report was an anchor document for American social science. And in meticulously mapped accounts and details, accompanied by charts, survey data, and careful statistical analysis, the Philadelphia Negro chronicled the processes by which the lives and lifestyles of middle class, as well as working class and unemployed Black Philadelphians were all affected by the hyper-segregation of real estate, economic opportunity, living areas, and access to healthy food and exercise. And Du Bois's methods were comparative and they were historical. The Philadelphia Negro's meticulous account of the spatial and social inequalities among segregated neighborhoods was a searching study of health and socioeconomic disparities between Black and white populations. It was also a general analysis of power relations, structural forms of violence, and racism, and historically constituted inequalities. It was not a single snapshot of circumstances and as an indicator of absolute differences between groups, which were common at the time. And rather, it described the differences in health and economic status in Black and white populations as historically and socially constituted by the dynamics of slavery and migration before and after emancipation. Du Bois painted a complex picture of communities that were impoverished in part because of their disproportionate burden of illness and in part because of inadequate housing and landlord refusals to complete needed repairs to dwellings inhabited by Black Americans. And this approach illuminated both the general effects of living conditions on individual health and the specific and pervasive role of racism as a structural and organizing force of American society. These socially structured differences, visible to anyone looking at a city map from across the room, work their way into bodily differences in health and illness, life and death. To compare the health of white Philadelphia and Black Philadelphia was not only to view, quote, side by side and an interrelationship in a large city, two groups of people who as a mass differ considerably from one another in physical health, end quote, but also to come to terms with powerful health disparities occurring in parallel in every urban and rural space in America. Observing the structural basis of health disparities, the report concluded, quote, should then act as a spur for increased effort and not as an excuse for passive indifference or increased discrimination. Du Bois fought hard against biological understandings of race that suggested that the higher mortality rate from tuberculosis was due to inherent biological differences between races. The methodologic advances of Du Bois and his colleagues were critical for combating widespread beliefs that racial differences in morbidity and mortality were proof of innate biologic differences between racial groups. Du Bois and other Black sociologists and physicians, mathematicians, refuted such arguments by clarifying the connections between the social world and health outcomes. In contrast to most physicians at the time, Du Bois was part of a key scientific counter-discourse, arguing that race was a social construction that is regularly reinvested with biological meaning. However, for most of the 20th century, mainstream physicians who thought about the social world as detached from the clinic and implied a deterministic sensibility rather than Du Bois's community engagement and dynamic analyses generally held sway in medical discourses. Perhaps that choice is unsurprising for a profession that routinely excluded Black physicians from membership in local, state, and national medical societies from Reconstruction after the Civil War until the late 1960s. Between 1944 and 1968, the American Medical Association voted 11 times to condemn racial discrimination in the abstract, while upholding the right of state and national medical associations to continue to exclude Black physicians. So at the margins of medicine, the sciences of health disparities research would ultimately be regularly rediscovered by Black physicians and social scientists whose work was published in organs of the Black press, such as the Journal of the National Medical Association and the publications wing of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Only much later, thanks to the efforts by the Association of the Minority Health Profession Schools and other generations of medical sociologists, such as David Williams at the University of Michigan in the 80s and 90s, would this research gain visibility in mainstream journals. At the same time, a movement which reached a triumphant moment in the late 20th century was the adoption of the United Nations statements on race. As some of you may already know, in 1950, 1951, 1964, and 1967, the United Nations convened a series of meetings of physical anthropologists and geneticists, which decided conclusively that more genetic variance existed within so-called races than between them. Contrary to dominant popular belief in the 19th and early 20th centuries, race was almost meaningless from a biological perspective. Yet reports by groups of experts rarely change the world overnight, and biological notions of race have continued to crop up on a regular basis, accelerating even in the early decades of the 21st century. Like the mythical biology of racial differences in medicine is almost like the myth of the Hydra. Anytime one head is cut off, another springs up to take its place. To take one recent phase of the rebiologization of race in medicine, and it's not Shaq, he's not to blame here, is the 2005, in 2005, the FDA approved the first racially specific pharmaceutical, Bidal, for the treatment of heart failure in African-American patients. In addition to an exclusive marketing license granted by the FDA, Bidal also received the first racially specific patent for pharmaceutical product. These 21st century claims were founded on a premise of biological difference. If a drug worked better in Black bodies than in white bodies, then there must be something in the biology of Black bodies that accounted for the difference, and it must be race. Only here's the catch. None of the clinical trials for Bidal actually demonstrated that the drug worked differently in Black bodies than in white bodies, nor did they even qualify how one could formally tell the difference between Black bodies and white bodies. This was all left to the commonsensical notion that one just knew these differences existed. Bidal quickly became a focal point for thinking about the persistence of biological notions of race in American medicine, even as the brand name drug itself faltered and never became the racially specific blockbuster drug that investors and marketers had hoped for. And yet, were I to suggest to you today that race had no place in medical education, I would hope that you, especially at this point in this lecture, would immediately raise some objections. For example, here in Baltimore last year, many of us were upset back in March of 2020 that COVID-related diagnostic and mortality data was being recorded and presented without regards to race. It would be fair to ask me, if you believe race is not a valid biological category, why is it important to record racial data for infectious disease? Isn't it against the interests of racial equity to consider race to be biologically relevant in the mapping of disease? The answer to this question became immediately apparent as soon as the state of Maryland began recording racial data, typically coded Black, white, and ethnic data, typically coded as Latino, non-Latino, of comorbidity and mortality. And the findings were immediate, stark, and undeniably important. In the state of Maryland, African Americans comprise 30% of the population, but nearly 50% of the COVID cases. Latinx patients were wildly overrepresented in COVID morbidity or mortality, even more so once race and ethnicity data began to be reported across the nation. As Maryland State Senator Anthony Brown noted, quote, Black Americans are bearing the full brunt of the coronavirus in Maryland, facing higher rates of infections and mortality. We cannot hide from this grim reality. We must confront these systemic racial disparities head on and do so right now. So this brings us to the paradox. What is the difference between these two situations? Where does the easy, lucrative use of race and bidal leave us uncomfortable, while the fact that advocates had to fight to have the differential morbidity and mortality from COVID feel like an urgent and pressing problem of our time? The quick answer, which I hope you all feel comfortable with by the end of this lecture, lies in the difference between medical logics of difference and disparity, which we will also explore in relation to historical change and continuity and the structuring of our built environment. And the longer answer, which will not resolve today, but will be a topic to keep coming back to over the course of a career, is that the matter of race is and will continue to be a stubborn problem in medicine, one which is tightly bound up in the relationship of social and biological bases of health and disease, and which we cannot turn away from simply because it's perhaps messier than the Krebs cycle or the pathophysiology of coronary artery plaque formation. In the case of COVID disparities in Maryland, the observation of racial difference was immediately interpreted as a product of disparity induced by social and historical conditions, structured into the social basis in which bodies live and develop. And as Representative Brown noted, Black Americans are more likely to be uninsured and more likely to have a frontline job during this crisis. These are not a priori biological differences that then manifest in an epidemic. They are biological differences that emerge because of the differential exposure to harm and differential access to care. They have enormous implications for individual patients and the health of the public. In the case of bidal, an assumed biological difference enabled a meaningless intervention based more in the process of securing an exclusive patent and exclusive racially based marketing rights for an otherwise generic drug. They have produced entirely negligible benefits for individual patients or for the health of the public. And it's crucial to come to terms with the distinction between difference and disparity, a concept that can be traced to the crucial Institute of Medicine report in 2002, Unequal Treatment, pictured here, which helped anchor the field of health disparities research. As the Institute of Medicine report noted, there is a difference between difference, in which race is a shorthand for heredity, that is to say that Tay-Sachs is more common in Ashkenazi Jewish populations, or sickle cell disease more common in African American populations, versus the role of structural, institutional, and individual racism in producing health disparities, both by shaping the differential degree of stress, strain, and risk on the body on the one hand, and limit access to equitable diagnostic treatment and prevention interventions on the other. And there's a catch here. If the problem in bidal has to do with the exaggeration of racial differences that don't really exist, the problem in the case of COVID data was the existence of real differences in the burden of disease between African American and white populations, which was only visible once people started looking for them. For example, in the 1970s, some, quote, discovered that African Americans experienced cancer diagnoses and cancer mortality in rates much higher than previously recognized. We know now that in many cancers, especially prostate cancer, African American patients have disproportionately higher rates of cancer diagnosis and mortality compared to the general population. But at the time, this information came as a surprise. Why? Was it because the underlying epidemiology of cancer had only recently developed in African American populations? Was it because the study of the epidemiology of cancer had only recently focused on African American populations? Was it because existing genetic studies suggested cancer was less likely to develop in African American patients? Or was it because American physicians, had been taught to think that cancer was not a disease that affected African Americans? Well, the answer was largely all four of these. A half century earlier, it was widely believed by physicians that African Americans did not die of cancer and barely had experience with the disease. Because to use just one of the racist frameworks of the day, as, quote, a primitive people, end quote, African Americans did not live long enough or experience the kind of stresses associated with modern life thought to be associated with the development of cancer. Cancer, as one popular textbook read in the 1920s, is mostly a product of civilization, a term which stood for Western civilization, and specifically for white bodies. As the historian Keith Whaley has described in his account of how cancer crossed the color line, the growth of cancer screening in the early 20th century was tightly tied to a widespread sense that the bodies that needed to be screened for cancer were white bodies, typically white middle-class bodies. Over the 1940s and 1950s, however, signals began to suggest that Black people were at least as susceptible to cancer. Only in the 1970s, when a landmark study was published by Black investigators at Howard University, did cancer become understood as a basis for racially and ethnically inscribed healthcare disparities, as we think of them today. A similar story can be told for heart disease. As Paul Dudley White, one of the founders of the American Heart Association and author of the first textbook of cardiology in American medicine, here told his student, Richard Allen Williams, the founder of the Association of Black Cardiologists in the 1960s, there was no point in studying coronary heart disease in the African-American population because no African-Americans ever got coronary heart disease. Needless to say, Williams persevered and became a leading scholar in documenting the increased morbidity and mortality from cardiovascular disease, especially hypertension and congestive heart failure in Black patients. But it took effort to do so, in part because many physicians hadn't even been bothering to check, for the most part, the extent to which the diseases like heart disease and cancer affected Black men and women. But if cancer and heart disease were associated with whiteness in the late 19th and early 20th century, another raft of diseases were deeply and directly associated with African-American bodies. Much of this began in the antebellum Southern medicine, most notably set forth and notoriously set forth by the New Orleans-based physician, Samuel Cartwright, who, noticing that respiratory ailments were common among African-American slaves, published several treatises on dysesthesia ethiopica, a lung affliction distinct to Black bodies. Cartwright's logic was, in a nutshell, that African-American slaves have weaker lungs, one of the many forms of evidence he sought to establish logics of white supremacy. That is, that Black bodies were somehow constitutionally inferior to white bodies. And when pressed, Cartwright would further argue, and this is not an anecdote, that this could be scientifically proven. Look at how many cases of lung disease I treat in enslaved people versus white patients. I'll show you the numbers. My claims are based in the best available evidence. Now, granted, his language was not that, but it was very, but the sentiment and perspective was identical. If we were in person, I'd ask you, what do you make of this interpretation? What else is involved here and how Cartwright gets from A to B in making these claims of innate constitutional difference? And what other explanations for trying to understand why an impoverished enslaved population living together in cramped corridors would be more prone to respiratory illnesses? And why are they not part of Cartwright's logic? Imagine what the differential toll is on a body working in a sawmill every day, working out in fields in the cold or in the extreme heat, living in cramped, dilapidated conditions heated by smoky fires with poor ventilation. Yes, increased rates of respiratory disease is a biological problem, but one which had many clear social determinants, grossly structured into the violent spaces made by slavery. Cartwright, of course, skips all of this. He describes his observation in a deterministic fashion. To him, Black bodies suffer from unique respiratory ailments like dysesthesia ethiopica because of the immature defective formation of their lungs compared to the normal healthy status of white lungs. I need to emphasize again how crucial it is to observe how these forms of observed inequalities in health outcomes were swiftly interpreted in terms of hardwired biological differences in disease. The historian Raina Hogarth refers to this process as, quote, medicalizing Blackness. Medicalizing here refers to the power to name disease in racial terms, which is intimately related to the power to name race as a biological form of difference. In these forms of difference and the pathologization predated, if these forms of difference and pathologization predated the Civil War, they were particularly exacerbated and expanded in the Reconstruction era. that followed and extended into the segregated hospitals and clinics of the Jim Crow era, including Johns Hopkins here and beyond. As historians Susan Reverby and Evelyn Hammonds argued in the Washington Post last year, the epidemics that ravaged Black bodies amidst the failed social and economic promises made in the beginning of Reconstruction, I'm referring here to the policy of giving 40 acres and a mule promised to each newly freed person upon emancipation, but which was reneged upon by the state governments. As Reverby and Hammonds notes, in the absence of land reform, left landless and impoverished, what ensued was what historian Jim Downs calls, quote, the greatest biological catastrophe of the 19th century. As epidemics of smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, and other diseases ripped their way through starving and ill-housed people, leaving 1 million dead or injured. White observers blamed excessive deaths from epidemic disease on so-called biological vulnerabilities inherent to Black people's bodies, which could only be mediated by re-enslavement at worst and denial of access to work at best to protect, quote, a weaker race. But in reality, these deaths were the result of economic policies, the economic disparities after emancipation. The creation of a class of Black yeoman farmers and shop owners in 1865, had it occurred, might have at least put a dent in the rise of Jim Crow or transformed the poverty that later set in motion the migrations of Black people out of the South into crowded cities. Instead, the highly visible health and economic inequalities of the South in turn moved north and westward. Hammonds and Reverby know that history lives with us in the present. The past, to paraphrase William Faulkner, isn't dead, it isn't even past. So thinking about change and continuity is crucial to understanding the persistence of health disparities in the United States and the persistence of race as a category of both difference and disparity in American medicine. Take, for example, of thinking with change and continuity, we turn to the medical historians Deirdre Cooper Owens and Charlotte Fett's example of continuity and change in racial disparities in Black maternal and infant health since 1619. If we think of disparities as a fixed thing, merely a matter of measuring data, we might look at CDC data and read this graph as an absolute form of difference between Black women, Native American women, and white women. Or we might look at the decades worth of data and say, these disparities are stable. If they are not getting much better, at least they're not getting worse. But that would be missing a key part of the story. Racial disparities in the United States in maternal and infant mortality have not improved over the old days. In the big picture, health disparities are much worse today than they were in the antebellum Civil War years. According to the best data we have of 1850, mortality rates for enslaved African-American infants was around 340 in 1,000, compared with 217 in 1,000 for white infants. That means an African-American infant was 1.6 times more likely to die in the first year of life with respect relative to a white infant. Fast forward to 2016, and the average non-Hispanic Black child born in the United States is 2.4 times as likely to die in the first year of life compared to a white child. While the absolute mortality has gone down for both groups, the disparity in infant mortality has increased by 50%. In 2018, in Brooklyn alone, Black women were 8 times more likely than white women to die of complications from pregnancy and childbirth. Cooper Owens and Fett speculate that this story doesn't make sense unless we see the continuities and stressors that has placed and continues to place Black infant and maternal health in jeopardy compared to white counterparts. From the introduction of the first African enslaved person to the British colonies in 1619 to the present day. They asked, when exactly in the historical sequence, beginning with the Atlantic slave trade with its grueling Middle Passage, then extending to the medical evaluations of the soundness of enslaved people for sale in the slave markets of port cities, through the chattel system of the plantation, in which Black health was foremost an economic concern for white owners, the economic deprivation of Reconstruction, the violence of the Jim Crow era, forcing the arduous displacement and second diaspora of the Great Migration to the industrial cities of the Northeast, Midwest, and West, where African Americans were only allowed to live in specific devalued subsections of urban spaces which once coded Black were subject to further economic deprivation well into the middle of the 20th century, through the defunding of public education and public parks in Black neighborhoods, through federal redlining practices beginning in the New Deal, which coded homeowner lending on a racial basis, in which Black neighborhoods colored red will be denied federal funding assistance and receive loans only at the most predatory rates. Their effects still visible, of course, in this 1964 map of the Baltimore Urban Renewal and Housing Authority, leading to the Baltimore Plan for Urban Renewal, which displaced Black families from vibrant community blocks into monolithic housing projects and into spaces increasingly characterized by policing strategies, increasingly militarized through the war on drugs effort. At what point in the sequence, they ask, can the environmental stressors on most Black maternal or child bodies be seen as equivalent to those on white mothers and children? How can we understand any one step in the sequence without understanding the links to what came before? Certainly the spatial maps, and there's a map here of Baltimore, certainly the spatial effects are still seen in maps of preventable deaths in the city of Baltimore today. And my own work has also explored this in relationship to the role of racial segregation on capacities to social distance during COVID-19. What you see here in these two maps are mapping mobility ratios across the United States by levels of racial segregation. And what we see here, especially, and I want you to focus on this magenta line, we see that in times early in 2020, when there were significant periods of lockdown and isolation, mobility dropped most significantly in segregated areas. But over the course of, well, in the United States, we called reopening processes in which the businesses and shops were allowed to reopen. We see very quickly, actually, the most rapid increase here in mobility in the most segregated counties. These findings are broadly in keeping with surveys on capacities to physically distance and isolate under episodes of pandemic influenza, which reflected similar limitations to the ability to distance along racial lines. And while more work should be conducted to understand which specific factors caused by racial segregation drive its relationship to increased mobility during this epidemic, the work suggests that racial segregation and its effects on mobility may explain some of the racial disparities associated with cases and deaths from COVID-19 in the United States. So this is a lot for one day, and there's much to follow up for in our discussion. And I'd like to largely end with a conclusion about thinking about how fundamentally to bring in new thought, new perspectives, new frameworks to our conversation. As we mentioned in the beginning with Du Bois, early Black social scientists envisioned a science of health disparities that would support meaningful action to advance equitable health and social outcomes. They insisted that Black people were not, quote, a problem, end quote, to be explained or solved by social science and medical authorities, but human beings deserving of full personhood. In his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois asked, how does it feel to be a problem? He worked to shift the goals of social analysis away from blaming the social ills and health ills on individuals or groups toward a richer understanding of the ways in which power relations shape life and health outcomes. Generations of Black theorists have continued this project, both in the United States and around the world. In the 1950s and 1960s, Martinique-born psychiatrist Frantz Fanon examined the deleterious effects of individuals' internalization of colonialism and racism and offered tools for decolonizing health and medicine, in addition to broader social systems. Fanon's own experience and psychiatric notes were essential to his theorizing on African anti-colonial action, which inspired entire fields of scholarship in the humanities. In the 1970s and 80s, Black feminist theorists Audre Lorde and Kimberly Crenshaw demonstrated how socially inscribed forms of difference, such as race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, did not inhabit separate coordinate planes. These forces intersect in powerful and synergistic ways, and understanding that intersectionality is crucial to elucidating how power relations produce social disparities. These perspectives, overlooked in Du Bois's critique of households led by Black working class women, are now a part of the basic toolkit for understanding health disparities. Mainstream medicine did not even acknowledge their contributions for decades. Instead, for most of the 20th century, mainstream physicians who thought about the social world emulated the clinical detachment and deterministic sensibilities that we discussed earlier. So to wrap up, we know that race is not clinically significant. There's no biological basis for race that is clinically significant. We do know that legacies of racism and persistent structural racism, as well as assumptions and beliefs, still structure the way that non-white patients are treated in medicine. When we think about diversifying voices as whether that's a solution, perhaps some of the racist studies and practices highlighted in this presentation could have been ameliorated through the presence of non-white researchers and doctors challenging racist assumptions. However, there needs to be effective space and equitable power dynamics to allow for these challenges to be heard and responded to without reprisal. Above all, medical practitioners must actively challenge their own assumptions and beliefs consistently. And I think also go beyond just challenging assumptions and thinking about and reading about the structural forces that lie behind racial disparities. So I want to end by saying this is not a prescriptive approach, but it's really an invitation to think beyond what we're currently thinking. Today's physicians in training and physicians more broadly, and actually all of us in the general public and those even tangentially linked to medicine, must grapple with our openness to more than re-education about the ways in which Black or minoritized people and other historically oppressed and marginalized groups are seen. So I encourage you, and as we get to the Q&A, to question our assumptions and priorities in the interest of recognizing and rectifying medicine's complicity with propagating inequities, but also read more history and social theory, if you like. That's a bit tongue-in-cheek since I'm a social theorist, but anyway. And only with awareness and knowledge can we really change behavior. And I would argue that recentering the work of Du Bois, the Atlanta School, the Sociology, and other Black and minoritized theorists of health and society could fundamentally help medical professionals, medical and public health scientists, and medical sociologists reckon with our skewed assessment of culpability for racial health disparities. It could prod medical educators, doctors, medical schools, and healthcare systems to question their assumptions and priorities in the interest of recognizing and rectifying medicine's complicity. Revisiting their work today helps us engage with race as a phenomenon continuously written and rewritten in the lived health disparities of millions of people around the world. So with that, I want to end. Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it.
That was terrific, Alexander. And so if people can enter into the chat, if they want to ask their questions directly or write them in, we're a small enough group today, it turns out that we could definitely open it up for people to speak. Oh, wonderful. Dan, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. There we go.
Thanks very much. First of all, just absolutely tremendous talk. That was completely, for just a regular white guy like me, it was just tremendously enlightening. My question is very specific to us as researchers. I'm writing lots of grants, and I'm trying to always be very careful about various EDI issues and social determinants of health. And definitely I know how to include gender in my studies. How do we include race in a country where race is not acceptable as a question? Neither is it it's not in social in data, in government and ministry data. And as far as I know, maybe I may be wrong, I'm not even allowed to ask for that. I'm allowed to ask for ethnic background at the most, or language.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. And I think this is this came up also when I was meeting with some French clinicians who are kind of grappling with or thinking about similar issues, which is to say that like the dynamics in the United States are rather unique relative to much of the rest of the world. They're not. I think, oh, my headphones just died. Can you hear?
It's okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
It's good.
Okay, sorry about that.
I think that what's fundamentally important is still to, as I mentioned, racial data on difference and disparity can be read in a host of negative ways, such that, I don't think it's necessary to have explicitly racial or ethnic data to explore questions of systemic injustice or disparities exclusively. In the US context, especially around COVID, it was essential. But these, I think there are ways of thinking, articulating, or at least developing forms of empathetic approaches that might recognize the histories of structural injustice that might affect health outcomes today. I'd love to kind of suggest that there's a standard social scientific approach that can be taken, but I would also argue that I think a researcher's disposition that attempts to empathize and speculate on the underlying social conditions that might affect health, that might be rooted or are likely rooted in histories of racial or ethnic injustice, is as crucial to this as any data. I hope that answers your question.
I have a related question, actually, Alexander. So a lot of us in Canada, like when we collect data, while Dan is absolutely right that routinely collected data does not include ethnocultural background, race in the health administrative data set, but on our census data, there are questions, and what we often wind up having is kind of like this combination of, there will be, what do you identify as, and there will be a category of Black, there'll be a category of South Asian, there'll be a category, then there'll be specific countries. So it's a bit of a mixed bag of things. And then what tends to happen in some of our own studies is that because they're not necessarily thousands of people, is we wind up collapsing white and non-white. So, you and I would be in the same category. So I was thinking that maybe it is at the point of the discussion that one at least kind of calls on sort of social factors and what would be your comment? Well, we can't do a disaggregated examination necessarily, but we still want to draw attention to any differences that we describe, that their roots are not, as until actually very recently, cannot be just said to be biological without some explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the pendulum swings in both ways in a negative direction here, especially around at times self-reported racial data becomes justification for race-specific algorithms and race corrections, which are the subject of massive debate within the American Medical Association, within the Journal of the American Medical Association, within the New England Journal of Medicine, et cetera, especially around pulmonary function and kidney function tests that correct for racial difference, right? So I think on one level you manage to hopefully, and I know this isn't universal, but hopefully avoid the casual invoking of race as a biologically significant factor as a result of not collecting these data. But on the other hand, perhaps it might make it more difficult to think about the structural histories. But that being said, I think another space where one would want to focus is that even if you're not collecting that data at a clinical or interpersonal level, it's very possible that doctors are making judgments and assumptions of patients based on their race, based on their ethnicity, based on their class, gender backgrounds, that also need to be confronted, which become harder to confront if there's less evidence for differential forms of care, right? So I think I would suggest remaining very attentive to that as well, especially in kind of the individual clinical space. And to add, the readings, the kind of broad literature review that I did in anticipation for this this talk, suggested that that a lot of the issues seem to be emerging in the clinical space in one-to-one interaction with doctors and patients, and the systematicity of those of racist outcomes in clinical care become more difficult when you can't see that, and you can't track trends. So I think that's where confronting biases and also confronting ways in which assumptions of biological difference and race crop up in medical education is really, really fundamentally critical.
Go ahead.
Thanks again for coming to talk. Really great talk. And also, everyone, by the way, today's American Thanksgiving, so Dr. White is taking away from his time there. I'm struggling a bit with how to formulate the question. So when I think about research on disparities, racial disparities, a lot of the research, my feeling, I haven't done a systematic review, my feeling, a lot of the research is focused on demonstrating disparities and the injustice of disparities, especially research that is led by sort of, I guess, non-minority researchers or institutions. In terms of research, I'm mentioning research because, again, we're mostly an audience of researchers. In terms of research on how to address and diminish the disparities, there's the rare randomized trial of, social interventions. They're very, very rare. But I'm wondering, and often the population that is the focus of research on disparities are the populations that suffer from the disparities. Are you aware? I'm not aware that there's been much research in terms of the other side of the disparity coin, meaning the populations who do not face these disparities. What I guess, is there room? Is there research that exists on understanding why do I guess what's the role of the other populations, and understanding, I guess, their perceptions of disparities, their experiences, to help understand how is there a role to understand that in terms of eliminating the disparities, right? Because that's, I guess, the majority populations are those who may benefit from them. I don't know if you have any takes on that or insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I teach a course called Africana Studies in Public Health, or Africana Studies meets Public Health, where we kind of think about scholarship from Africana Studies, a wide variety of this, to kind of think about rethinking health disparity research differently, and social determinants of health. One thing that I think is a real challenge with this sort of research is that so often we find the disparity and then we fail to attribute any agency to the production of those disparities, right? We fail to recognize actually how disparities are perpetrated and perpetuated and maintained. So there's no kind of question of power there. It's just like, these disparities exist and we need to figure out how to get rid of them, as opposed to thinking about the forces that are acting upon populations and then subsequently produce those disparities. So I think there's a attunement to those questions and those questions of power that I'm trying to figure out ways to bring into my own work. Another aspect of this, and I think health disparities research so often, especially in medical sociology, which is kind of my home discipline, thinks so much about kind of flexible resources and things in terms of like, well, people who are healthier have access to a variety of resources, social and political and economic capital that they can leverage at times when they're ill to offset the worst case scenarios, right? And they can mobilize these resources in a variety of different ways that, people on the other side of the disparity equation cannot. But once again, I think that research doesn't critically investigate why some groups have those resources and why other groups don't. So I think the real conversation that I would love to have, and I'm trying to have and trying to think about how to do, is like bringing in sustained sociological humanities research on racism. It's the ways in which it operates with that health disparities work that kind of doesn't have a complicated understanding of structural violence, racism's systems of oppression on a variety of lines, and bring them into conversation. I'm not sure if that's I don't think that's an answer, but hopefully it's a bit of a diagnosis of some of the issues. Hope that was helpful.
Kevin, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for a brilliant talk, really super, especially at the Thanksgiving holiday time. I guess my question's a bit, or thoughts are perhaps slightly different, and I'm struck by the fact that kind of, well, if you want to call it getting our own house in order in medicine, if you want to call it that, is necessary but not sufficient. And you've obviously emphasized that very much in your talk, which I think we all appreciate, the fact that, medicine, we operate as very much as part of, broader social forces and elements, whether for bad or for good. In Quebec, we have, you may have, I don't know if others have told you, we have a situation where an Indigenous woman died in the healthcare system under terrible conditions. We've had a lot of discussion about that over the last months, where our Prime Minister or Premier refuses to acknowledge the presence of systemic racism and structural racism in Quebec society or the healthcare system, despite these events. And so I guess what I'm driving at is, based on your experiences more in the US, what do you see as sort of positives or opportunities to be able to better engage with political leadership on these questions? Because until we do that, we're going to really just be re-reporting the same disparities in the ways that you've mentioned very eloquently.
That's a phenomenal question. I think we are going to be kind of playing out rather depressing, the same depressing conversations, especially in the public sphere for some time. I think that discourse is somewhat similar to also, what's going on in the UK around, British reports. It was like, well, there's no structural racism in Britain. That doesn't exist. And I think that we have to fight against that in a variety of different ways. And I think doctors have always been at the forefront of that. Fundamentally, perhaps not as at an institutional level, but certainly at an individual or collective level. I don't think we've had tremendous success in the United States broadly, especially over the last 2 years. I think that our debates around disparities in COVID vaccination rates along racial lines continue to situate non-white populations as a problem to be solved, and a problem to be solved for the purposes of, largely protecting the larger white population from COVID, which is to say that the underlying health disparities, inequalities that are historically and socially constituted are not what are up for, discussion, debate, or resolution. What we're trying to do now is vaccinate as many people as possible so we can at least get rid of COVID, and we won't think about those underlying issues. Now, obviously, I'm fully in support of full vaccination of the population. I have been working a lot in health equity, but I think one of the things that we're trying to do down here is make sure that a lot of the community level supports are maintained after this epidemic wanes and subsides in some way, which, the likelihood is that they'll all go away. We don't have a national health system, famously, like you do in Canada. So I think those are some issues there. But I think that the being very real and confronting, not only, I think it's so easy to think about the case that you mentioned in Quebec as a single instance, right, which is not evidence of a systemic problem, right? It's the kind of the few bad apples sort of argument, and I think that I hope that the method and approach that I provided demonstrates a way of thinking systematically and systemically about racism and how it operates and the ways in which it can lead to a situation like that, as opposed to thinking about like just one or a group of you know, malpracticing doctors, for instance. I'm wearing my sociologist hat. I recognize that we're very bad at providing answers, and when we do provide answers, they're usually the wrong ones. So, but hopefully, opening up new questions.
Join the club.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Alexander, for a wonderful talk. I love hearing from sociologists and anthropologists because my father was an anthropologist and a sociologist. So this was terrific. There's a couple of other comments. I'll just very quickly. Osmin Medina commented that they're doing a study, and a white participant left for Europe and was able to continue the trial without problems because all the conditions were ideal afterwards: internet access, security, transport, etc. But a Black participant left for IT and had to leave the device in Montreal because of the opposite: no electricity, no internet, insecurity to transport. So just sort of highlighting that even in the execution of a project, there's some differences. It was a wonderful talk. We really, really enjoyed it. People may reach out to you with questions, and maybe we'll have you back again. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. It was really, really a pleasure. Thanks.